So far, my most popular video by far is a video about how much a tree is worth, which really is just an overview about how standing timber is valued. And that video continues to get views, and most importantly, it continues to get comments. And I love reading those comments. The vast majority of them are extremely complimentary. But, of course, it's the internet, so I'm also going to get a lot of criticism. And those criticisms never fail to amuse me. And I don't say that out of a sense of arrogance, but I say it because the criticisms are often for completely different reasons. So in the video, I valued a high quality red oak tree, and I believe I valued it for around $160 for that single tree. But the kicker is that then I analyzed it in the context of a broader forest. And I mentioned that if you had 100 of those trees per acre, well then you'd have $16,000 per acre. Now I'm not sure about you, but to me that sounds like a pretty high number. And so I got two types of criticisms from two different types of people. The first criticism was from landowners, the second was from loggers. The landowners said that they would never sell a tree for $160 and that it was a scam, it was a ripoff, and they might as well just leave it standing. The loggers were chastising me for giving landowners unrealistic expectations, and then they continued to criticize my soft, unworked hands and so on. Now, if there's one thing I learned from being a forester, it's that if you're getting criticisms from every different angle for contradictory reasons, it usually means you're doing the right thing. If at any point someone is extremely happy with you, it usually means that someone else somewhere else in the supply chain is getting screwed over. But in this case, I'm probably going to have to say that the loggers here are valid in their criticisms. Receiving $16,000 per acre for a timber harvest is a very high amount, and the reason it's so high in that analysis is because I chose a very high quality stem. And if you were to have 100 of those stems per acre, in order to have that, you would have had to be doing consistent and intensive silviculture for decades. In the vast majority of situations, that is simply not going to be the case. And I actually remember when I was uploading that video, whether or not I should edit that part out, because I was wondering if maybe it would have been a little dishonest. But then I decided that the purpose of the video wasn't really about how much timberland was worth, but rather how trees are valued, so I went ahead and posted it as a hypothetical. So the fact that despite that, there are still landowners who think that this is, a scam or not enough money, probably indicates that there are some severely unrealistic expectations in the market. So the question is, why these unrealistic expectations persist? And some of the comments referenced the final retail price of a board of high quality timber. And that kind of gives a clue as to why people feel like it's not enough. They see the price of boards on the shelf of a store or in a lumber yard, and they think, how come I'm only getting a small fraction of that amount? And so they associate that with some sort of injustice. So in this video, I wanted to give an overview as to why your standing timber is virtually worthless in comparison to a finished product. So let's first talk about what exactly your timber is. Your timber is a tree in a forest. To get such an unrefined product into a state that has value for the end consumer, it essentially has to go through 4 processes, one of which you could say it goes through twice. The first process is the logging process that brings it in the form of a tree to a log at roadside. The second process is transportation. It has to be transported to a facility that can turn that log into a finished board. Then it has to go into the milling process at the sawmill to be able to turn it into that board, and then it has to be transported again to go to the 4th process, which is the retail process, to actually market it and get it into the hands of the end consumer. Now, there are similar processes with virtually any product on the market, but timber is a bit more complex, so let's talk about exactly what has to be done. So let's first talk about the harvest of the timber. And harvest systems can be broadly broken down into 3 categories. You have cut to length, whole tree, and conventional. A cut to length system involves 2 machines, a processor and a forwarder. The processor cuts and delimbs the logs and cuts them into predetermined lengths, and the forwarder picks up those logs and piles them at the roadside. Now, these 2 machines are extremely expensive. A new processor can run around $750,000. A new forwarder can run around $500,000. Now, of course, keep in mind these prices are very variable, but this is just to give you an idea of how much these machines can run. So that brings the total capital expense of the cut to length system around $1.25 million just to bring this tree to the roadside in the form of a log. Next, we have the whole tree system, which, unlike the cut to length, uses 3 machines. First, you have the feller buncher, which cuts the tree, picks it up, and piles it into bunches, which are then carried by the grapple skidder. The grapple skidder brings these whole trees roadside, and those trees are then picked up and processed by a delimber, which pulls the tree through a set of blades to remove the limbs and bring it into something resembling a processed log. For this system, the feller bunchers can run $500,000, the grapple skidders can run $200,000 to $300,000, and the delimbers can run another $400,000. So that also brings the total capital expense of this system to $1.2 million. Now, of course, you can get them for cheaper if they're used, but the thing about these machines is that every single part on them is extremely expensive. It is not at all uncommon for a single part to run around $20,000. And sometimes, because these parts are specialized, it can take a long time for delivery and repair. So whether or not you're running a new or older system, it's still extremely expensive. Now, on the cheaper side of things, you do have the conventional system, which consists of a guy in a chainsaw manually cutting down trees and then pulling them roadside with a cable skidder. Now, cable skidders, they're not really bought new anymore, but you can get a decent cable skidder for around $20,000. The problem is, it's extremely labor intensive, and of course, as is the case with all these machines, they have to be operated by a laborer, which, can be a pricey variable expense in itself. Or maybe you're me and you kind of do a hybrid system and you import a kind of silly little Chinese forwarder for very cheap, but in that case, it's a more limited system. Basically, in logging, it doesn't matter what you do, there's no way to fully avoid the expense of logging, and it's extremely expensive. But that's just getting the logs to the edge of the road. They still have to be transported. And you need more than just a log truck. You need a way to get those logs onto the truck. So you're either going to have a crane or a self-loader, which is essentially just a log truck with an attached crane. And as you can imagine, both of those are very expensive. We're talking, in the realm of $100,000 or so. Of course, again, it's hard to find the exact prices. So once they're actually on the truck, then they have to be transported to the mill. And sometimes this is easy, sometimes it's hard. It really depends on how far away you are from the mill. These logs might have to travel 100 miles or more just to be turned into logs. And that can be pretty expensive because, as you can imagine, these trucks don't have the best fuel mileage. Then the truck arrives at the mill. And how does the mill pay the logger? Well, they have to figure out how much volume is actually in the truck. So they either have a scaler who's manually measuring the logs and trying to figure out how much each is worth, or then you have also a weight-based system where they have to be put on scales. In either case, you're talking about labor and capital expenditures. So we're increasing the total capital expense of turning this tree into a board. Now, once the log is off the truck, it's then going to be piled into a log yard. So it once again has to be removed off the truck and piled. And where there's piles, there's also another means of removing the log from that pile. So sometimes you have giant cranes at sawmills, other times you have smaller truck-based cranes, but in any case there has to be a way to transport those logs from the log yard to the actual mill facility. And while you can have small-scale sawmills, where somebody just bought a $50,000 wood miser or something like that, if it's an industrial sawmill, then that is a capital expense somewhere in the tune of, $30 to $40 million. So this facility pushes the logs into a series of saw blades that turn the round logs into dimensional lumber. And that itself is an extremely expensive process that again involves a lot of expensive and skilled labor. But that's not the end of it, because then you have a green, which means, still very moist, and rough board. You have to both kiln dry it and plane it. Now, the kiln drying process is, to say the least, energy intensive. You have to take these boards and dry them for days, not minutes, not hours, but days. And you have to power that kiln the entire time. And heat, as you can imagine, is energy intensive. Now, sometimes they can use the sawdust to power it or whatever, but it's still very expensive to do that. And then once these boards are dried, then they go through a planing mill to be nice and smooth. And sometimes they go through further processing to give them tongue and groove or something like that. So finally, we have a product that is theoretically valuable to the end consumer, but you still have to get it to the consumer's hands. And that's where it all depends on your marketing and business strategy of the specific sawmill. But basically it has to be sent to a wholesaler, which then sells them to retailers or something of that sort. Now, of course, there are smaller sawmills that you can buy directly from, but that doesn't mean it's free to get rid of those boards. You still have to market it. Dealing with customers is expensive and time consuming. And when you're already running a sawmill, sometimes that can just be overwhelming. So no matter what, it's expensive to get it into the hands of consumers. And sometimes you have to transport it and deliver it, even if you're selling it direct to consumers. So when all is said and done and the final board is in the hands of the consumer, what % of the value does the landowner actually receive? Obviously, it's incredibly variable. I can't give you a solid answer. I think 10% is a pretty good rule of thumb. And if you look at official data, it tends to reflect that. And of course, there are ways for that number to move up and down. For example, if you have high quality timber, it costs the same amount to harvest that versus low value timber of the same size. So the landowner can command a higher % of the total value for that sort of situation. But let's just say here 10%. Is 10% a lot? It's all relative. If you look at agriculture and a farmer is going to receive, maybe 15 to 20% of the value of their product. But the thing about a farmer is a crop in the ground is itself a saleable product. There's effectively no difference than the potato I pull out of the ground and the potato I pick up at the supermarket. Maybe it's washed a little more, but it's the same thing. And so some farmers actually have a pick your own model of business. I used to love going apple picking as a kid. Occasionally I'll still go berry picking with my parents or something like that. And you can do that, it works. But imagine if you went to Home Depot and you wanted to get some 2x4s and they gave you some coordinates for a tree somewhere in the middle of the mountains. It wouldn't work out well. So a farmer has a product that is actually valuable to the end consumer. You as a landowner, your tree, they have to go through a lot of transport and a lot of processing before they have any actual value. And in that situation, I'd say 10% is pretty fair. And this is especially true if you consider that a forest is the Earth's default. A farmer has to do a lot of work just to keep up on his farm. He has to remove weeds. Even if the economy turns down and he doesn't plant for a while, he has to make sure that that field doesn't degrade. And there are even some cases where they call a failed farm a forest because that's what comes up after it's abandoned for long enough. So while you as a landowner absolutely can put investment into your land and do things to increase the final value of the trees that you grow, you can also do absolutely nothing and still grow a forest. And so receiving 10% on something that just happens naturally as a result of Earth's natural processes is pretty cool in my opinion. And of course, none of this is to say that it isn't possible to be ripped off by loggers or that a landowner might not receive the true value of what's on their land. And I'm not trying to diminish any of that. What I am saying is that you need to have some realistic expectations about what your wood is actually worth. And if you want it to be worth more, then you need to practice forestry and silviculture. And a great way to do that is a little bit of a self-plug here. I wrote a book that you can receive for free. It's called How to Read Your Forest. And in that, I document the basics of forestry to kind of give yourself a head start in understanding exactly what is silviculture, how forests are managed, and how you can get the best value from your land at the time of harvest so you can have a productive asset for you and your family. So I really encourage you to check that out. I'm going to leave it a link in the description. Probably I'm also going to pin a comment down there with the link in there also. So please check that out. So I really do hope that this video can give you as a landowner appreciation for not only the complexity, but also the sheer expense involved in logging and milling and everything regarding forest transport. And, hopefully now the loggers will lay off me and my soft hands a little bit. So if you have any thoughts or comments or additional questions, please post them in the comments below. I try to respond to as many people as possible. And of course, if you got value from this, please like and subscribe. There's going to be a lot more content like this on its way. So that's all for now. I'll see you later.